Welcome to our Foundation Budget Forum on local schools and state resources. My name is Marissa Carreri and I'm a member of the East Hampton School Committee, and I am delighted to be in this room with all of these people who have taken such interest in the foundation budget, which very well might be the single wonkiest issue in public education. I want to take a moment to thank a few people. First of all, big thanks to Tracy Novick and Nathaniel Shea for coming out this evening to speak with us. I also want to acknowledge Sarah Amoroso, who is an East Hampton parent and an engaged citizen who's helped coordinate the event for us tonight. Also, thanks to our East Hampton High School Key Club and National Honor Society for providing childcare for us this evening. And to East Hampton Media for recording this event. It will be archived so that way people who weren't able to make it tonight will be able to get this information from their own homes.
Nope. Go ahead.
So I'm excited about this workshop because I'm hopeful that through events like this one and through conversations with people in our communities, foundation budget can become a word that is as common to the popular vernacular as standardized testing or unfunded mandates or charter schools. Last year with the Question 2 initiative, we saw that when the people of Massachusetts are given an opportunity to really get informed about issues affecting public education, they stand up for their public schools. We hope that we can raise citizen awareness about the foundation budget as another crucial factor determining what our districts can offer our students, so that we can use our collective power to urge our legislators to update and fix this outdated and flawed funding formula. Ultimately, we want our state government to pay its fair share. I must confess that I myself am relatively new to the foundation budget issue, and as I've made my first forays into trying to understand this thing, I've been promised it is not for the faint of heart. However, I think we are in good hands tonight. We have excellent people to really help us get to understand this topic. Tracy O'Connell-Novick is the field director of the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, and she is our foundation budget extraordinaire. Through MASC, Tracy offers training and policy services, educates school committee members as to the value and use of social media and technology to enhance local communications, and to advocate on a statewide level for education issues. Which, side note, I highly recommend you follow her on Facebook or Twitter. She will keep you on the know on all the education issues going on across the state. Tracy has taught high school English and served on the Worcester School Committee for 6 years, and she has been a lifelong advocate for speaking up when things need to change. We also have with us Nathaniel Shea, Chief of Staff for Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz. Nathaniel works on education policy and constituent services for the Senator, and he has traveled out here to East Hampton from Boston this evening in order to talk to us about Senator Chang-Diaz's proposed legislation titled An Act Modernizing the Foundation Budget for the 21st Century. In a moment, we'll begin with a presentation by Tracy, and then we'll hear from Nathaniel, and then we'll open up to questions or comments from the audience. I know a number of people here are from neighboring districts, and after our guest speakers, it would be great to hear from you about the concerns that you're facing in your districts. I know that the East Hampton School Committee is really open and interested in working with school committees in the region to really form some coalitions around this issue, so that way we can advocate to our state legislators to get the changes that we need in order to update the foundation budget. And particularly as we know that sometimes our interests out here in Western Massachusetts can go underrepresented on Beacon Hill. So we'd love to reach out and work with other school committees on this issue. So at this time, I will turn it over to Tracy. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, there we go. Also, I want to acknowledge that we actually have some solid representation here from MASC. There's actually two other field directors who are here. Liz LaFond and Pat Carrera are both here. And past President Jake Oliveira and Vice President Devin Sheehan are here as well. So you actually, as much as people aren't accustomed to that in speaking as someone from Worcester, other parts of the state, there actually is fairly strong representation for MASC in the Pioneer Valley. So I wanted to start, first of all, by putting those of you to whom this is new at ease. This isn't scary, and I promise you'll actually come out of this in one piece. I will say that for those of you who've heard me present on this before, some of this is going to be old hat, although I also understand that for most of us, a quick review on how the foundation formula works is never a bad thing. So it's useful to understand when we talk about funding of education in Massachusetts, why it is we do it at all. And we could go back to, honestly, the 1630s if we wanted to talk about public education in Massachusetts. We had statewide legislation as early as that. We weren't going to be able to go on as a democratic state unless we had a well-educated citizenry. So as they were looking ahead and saying, eventually this generation will die out, how will we continue? The notion was that you needed to have democratic education in order to have that happen. The second part that's interesting about this passage from the state constitution is who it is that is charged with public education. As I said, as early as the 1630s, we actually saw what was colonial law at the colonial level around public education, mandating that there be schools once you got to a certain size of an area. But the Constitution puts the responsibility in two places: legislatures and magistrates. Legislatures are exactly who we would think of when we think of the legislature, the people who now meet on Beacon Hill, the state. Magistrates is their word for local government. So it's the responsibility not only of the state, but also of the locality, of those in town government, in city government, and school committees to provide for public education. So this is important, first of all, just as a general principle, that this is a shared responsibility, but it particularly becomes important as we start to move into more modern times. Once we got into the 1970s, the 1980s, we still were seeing schools that were largely funded through property taxes. I'm sure many of us remember that. Proposition 2.5 came through and limited the amount of growth that could take place in terms of property taxes. And much as we're actually seeing in some parts of the state right now, there were districts that were bumping up against as much money as they possibly could raise, and were finding that that wasn't adequate to actually serve their students. And they realized that this was supposed to be a shared responsibility. At that point, the state was giving money to education, but it wasn't doing so in any kind of a fashion that recognized need or that did it on the basis of any kind of statewide system. There was some political influence involved, should we say. So there were a number of districts across the state that during the 80s and 90s filed suit against the state, saying that the state wasn't fulfilling its responsibility to local districts. And that came together in 1993 in a suit known as McDuffie. McDuffie was a student in Brockton. And the Supreme Judicial Court in June of 1993 found in favor of the plaintiffs. It's actually a fascinating passage. If you're into that kind of stuff, there's really some great language in McDuffie. But this passage in particular is actually where it's coming back to the constitutional mandate. In other words, the notion of the duty and the cherishing that's in the Constitution isn't just nice language, it actually is obligatory. And in particular, the Commonwealth has a duty to provide education for all of its children, rich and poor, in every city and town in the Commonwealth at the public school level. And the Supreme Judicial Court then charged the state with coming up with a system to do so. Kind of a big mess. However, conveniently, the state passed the education reform law in June of 1993. Yes, they knew that they were going to lose the lawsuit. We tend to think of the education reform law as what brought us the MCAS, what brought us state standards. If you're in school committees, you might know that that actually was a major change in how school committees operated. But the thing that at base the 1993 ed reform law was it was a funding law. It was actually a major overhaul in how we funded public education in Massachusetts. And every year when the House and the Senate and eventually together come to get together around a state budget, they essentially repass Chapter 70 with new numbers and a system of how we actually fund public education. So this is a chart which may look familiar to some of you. It may look like something you've never seen before for others of you. For every district in the Commonwealth, there is a spreadsheet like this. Almost everything I'm going to show you up here is on DESE's website. We actually have a very good system of reporting finances in Massachusetts. So there's very little that I'm going to show you today that isn't available to just about anyone. So when the state was faced with this issue of how are you going to figure out how to share this responsibility, the first thing they did was they said, okay, what does it take to run a school system? And it narrowed it down to, in this case, it's now 11 things. At one point it was 14. But I mean, we'd all probably, if we put our heads together, could come up with a list that looked something like this. Stuff like teachers, right? Things like materials. You got to keep the lights on and heat the building. You need to have different kinds of services for students, guidance, libraries. You need to make sure that you have assistants in some of the classrooms, and so forth. A couple things of note here. Special education tuition is its own line item. That's the out-of-district services for students. Also, there's no, for example, transportation. And depending on where you are, you understand that that's a pretty massive issue. Transportation comes back into regional districts through a different part of the budget. Originally, municipal districts were also supposed to be reimbursed for transportation. That's something we haven't seen in some time. But because it varies so widely across the state, they essentially didn't come up with any way to do that. So for each of these levels, each of these sections, there essentially is a set of numbers behind it. So for each child who is sitting in a classroom here in East Hampton or anywhere else, there's an assumption that, okay, that kid's gonna need a teacher. It's gonna need a principal. There's gonna need to be some central administration oversight. You're gonna need to make sure that that kid has access to different kinds of services, and the building has to be heated in the wintertime, and the lights need to stay on. The teacher's gonna need health insurance. And all of those have dollar amounts attached to them per child. We then count how many kids you have. And this literally is an October 1 enrollment report that every district gives to the state. It's done by section. I don't know how well you can read that, but it is preschool, half-day K, full-day elementary, and so forth through. Two things that are of note. One is these two right here are English language learners. These three right here are English language learners. They are their own category because there's a recognition by the state that those students are probably going to need additional teachers because they're learning English. The other thing that's on here is vocational, and that's the highest in terms of dollar amount. Any of you who are familiar with vocational education can understand why. There's a lot of equipment, and there needs to be very few kids in those classrooms because of the equipment. Those are based, again, on actual count. So those are the kids who actually are sitting in classrooms. This is the FY18, so looking at next year for East Hampton. This is based on who East Hampton had in classrooms this past October 1. So yes, if you're thinking about it, it does mean there's a 1-year lag. It's not based on the kids that actually are sitting in classrooms next year. Those are actual counts, and they would get multiplied by each of the categories. There are 3 categories, however, that aren't based on student enrollment reports. And there are these 3 at the end. In-district special education is based on a flat 3.75% of your actual enrollment. Now, there's a whole bunch of school committee members out here who are frowning, and that's because they know that there's no district in the state that has 3.75% of their students in special education. The out-of-district special education is based on 1% of your enrollment. Also, not based on anything according to reality. Now, there's 2 explanations for this. The first is that most students who are in in-district special education don't spend all of their time in special education. Spend the whole push that we've had, particularly over the last 25 to 30 years, of trying to make sure that more of the students are mainstreamed. That's the first argument. The second one, though, is if you get DESE talking and people who were around at the time talking, they will freely admit to you that there was an assumption by the state that if they did actual pupil counts, that districts would drive up their special education numbers in order to drive up their budgets and get more state aid. You can take that for whatever it's worth in terms of levels of trust to various ends of government. Nonetheless, it is actually true. So you take both of those in terms of just the flat percentages off of your enrollment, and there's an additional dollar amount that comes with them. The final one is economically disadvantaged, which if you've seen these spreadsheets in past years, used to be called low income. Used to be based on a count that was done at the district level. Economically disadvantaged is a switch that took place when a lot of districts like Springfield and Boston and Worcester switched to having universal free lunch through something called community eligibility. Districts are eligible for community eligibility based on the number of students who are enrolled in state services, so not based on counts. As more and more districts were switching to that and no longer counting free and reduced lunch, we started to have a pretty big dichotomy between these fairly large districts with lots of kids who actually are in need and kind of everybody else. And as the gap kept getting farther, DESE got concerned. So they switched the whole state over to economically disadvantaged 2 years ago. This is actually based, again, on how many students you have enrolled in things like SNAP, Mass Health, food stamps, and so forth. There's four categories. There is, first of all, absolutely, probably not a district in the state that actually went up in count. However, DESE did adjust the dollar amount that went along per pupil on this to something higher at the same time that they were switching to economically disadvantaged. Like any other switch, there were winners and there were losers. And there are a couple of districts that substantially lost students, particularly those that either have high rates of immigrant students who maybe would be willing to sign up for free lunch but aren't necessarily enrolled in state services. And also there are areas of the state where people might be willing to sign their kid up for free lunch but are never going to enroll in state services of other kinds. So those are districts that actually had a tough time adjusting. We're actually still seeing funding come through for some of the districts that are seeing substantial losses there. Once you add those on top of your multiplication problem from the other part, you end up with a foundation budget. So for East Hampton, for FY18, for next year, the state is saying that at a minimum, in order to have an adequate education for the children of East Hampton needs to spend $18.4 million. Okay. I think that some of the school committee members are saying, I've never seen $18.4 million. Where is this number coming from? Yes, okay, which tells you something, by the way, about your district. If I were to ask Devin, who's from Holyoke, about his foundation budget, he could probably tell you what it is because it's probably about what they actually spend in Holyoke. And I know I would tell you that about Worcester. So we're going to come back to that, but there's a reason why some of you recognize them and some of you don't. The main way in which the foundation budget changes from year to year is inflation. So your individual district may see more kids in kindergarten than a previous year, or you may see more kids move into vocational. You may see an influx of English language learners or fewer of them. That will change your foundation budget. But the main way in which it changes from year to year is the inflation rate. Now, if you look at the numbers behind me, particularly these the last couple of years, you'll notice that these probably don't bear a lot of resemblance to anything that you would otherwise call inflation. It's probably not actually the rate at which your school budget went up, probably not the rate at which your family budget went up, or even any part of any of those budgets went up. Part of that is because of what it's based on. It's the price deflator index for state and local governments, which essentially is if you took how much Massachusetts and all of its individual towns and then did that for everybody in the country and figured out how much it went up by quarter, their spending went up by quarter, well, you get into some funny feedback loops in terms of whether or not it goes up or down from year to year when you do it that way. But that's what it's based on. The whole foundation budget goes up by this amount on the years where it goes up. There have been years where it doesn't. That dichotomy of the difference between how much the inflation budget goes up, the foundation budget goes up, and how much your actual budget needs to go up is what leads us into the next section here. But before we get to that, I do want to recognize something that is what I was implying before when I was talking about Holyoke's budget versus East Hampton's and so forth. You don't have to only spend your foundation budget. You're supposed to spend that as a minimum, and the state does keep an eye on it. You can go 5% below in a year, but you have to make it up later. You can, however, out of local resources, spend more. So the bottom line here is 0, which is the foundation budget. So that's what the state says is adequate to educate children in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts under McDuffie. Right there. This is the current state average. So statewide, districts are spending on average 20% more than the foundation budget in their budgets. That's a fifth more than what the state says is adequate. And something that I think is an important thing to point out. You'll see this in a minute, but most cities are spending here, with the exception of Boston. Your big cities, Springfield, Worcester, you look at Lawrence and Lowell and Fall River, New Bedford, they're all down there, which means that the people who are spending up here are largely towns, and a lot of those are town meetings where taxpayers go into town meeting and they vote themselves tax increases to spend a fifth more on public education. And so much in the way that Marissa was talking about local people making decisions on question 2. Local people are kind of telling us something here when we're spending 20% over foundation at a statewide average. To bring this into what it looks like locally, here's what East Hampton is spending in terms of foundation. Remember, this isn't a dollar amount, it's a percent over the foundation budget. So East Hampton has consistently been over the minimum amount it's required to be. I think it's at 3.6 for this ends in FY16 because FY16 is the last completed year. And then because we all essentially as towns live in neighborhoods, I thought it would be important to see what the rest of the neighborhood looks like. So here's Amherst Pelham Regional. Here's Northampton. Northampton's kind of keeping track with the statewide average, although they're a bit below. Here's Hadley, Hampshire Regional, and then Chicopee, Springfield, and Holyoke. Okay? If I ran you a chart that was just the gateways, it would be really boring because everybody would be down by the white line. And while on this one, it looks like Hampshire and Amherst are real outliers. Remember, if you've got a statewide average and you've got big districts that are all on the bottom end, you got to have a lot that are on the top end to outweigh it. So that's not that unusual to have 30 or 40% over foundation happening. God bless you. So what does that mean? If East Hampton is, God bless you, over foundation, but not over foundation by a lot, once they start getting into their budget, they've got a little bit of wiggle room, but they don't have a lot of wiggle room. This ends up reflecting 2 places more than anything else. And I'm going to show you one. The other one is in multiple categories, and so it's a little complicated to do. Health insurance, I am sure that if I asked any of you about your own personal health insurance, it didn't go up by 1.66% from last year. And it didn't go up by 2 point anything else the year before. And your district health insurance, I am sure, did not go up by that amount. But your foundation budget did. Now, East Hampton has a little bit of room, but it doesn't have a lot of room. The foundation budget for East Hampton, remember on that chart it said benefits was a section, and the assumption from the state was that East Hampton would be spending $1.7 million in FY16 on health insurance. In fact, East Hampton spent $3.3 million. Now remember, East Hampton's only got an $18 million budget. They're spending a little bit more than that, so they got a little bit of wiggle room. But if you take this gap, which they're already starting out at 50% on this one, and you assume a similar gap on special education, which tends to be the case, the special education gap tends to be parallel. It happens in multiple categories, so I don't usually put a chart in for that. Then that's where you're setting off for the rest of your accounts. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't have anything to do with how East Hampton negotiates with their teachers union. This doesn't have anything to do with how East Hampton manages to negotiate its health insurance. I can show you an identical chart. Numbers will be a little different, percentages will be a little different, but an identical chart for every district in the state. There's not a district in the state that's actually spending on health insurance at the foundation budget because it's physically impossible, right? Your health insurance has been going up by 5%, 6%, 9%, 12% a year, and the inflation rate has been 1.6, 2.5, 3 point, whatever. You can't keep up. There's going to be a gap, it's going to grow. So what does East Hampton do? Well, the money has to come from somewhere. Now, because East Hampton has that little bit of wiggle room, it's been funding over foundation, this category doesn't get as badly devastated as it does in other places, and I'll show you that in a minute. But in East Hampton, for the classroom teaching account, which is always the biggest account in every district, because teaching is what we do, East Hampton in FY16 was spending 77.8% of the foundation budget in classroom teachers. That's not terrible, but it's not what anybody really wants to see happening, because the last thing you want is to see your classroom teaching account be less than it actually should be. Where else did the money come from? This is the other teaching services. This is paraprofessionals, librarians, so forth. East Hampton was only spending 68.9% of the foundation budget in FY16. Now, this one looks really scary, so let me hasten to add that professional development tends to get hit because of Title IIA. Title IIA actually comes from the federal government and very oftentimes is spent on professional development, so a lot of districts backfill with Title IIA. So this isn't all of the money that East Hampton spent on professional development. However, East Hampton spent less than 3% of the foundation budget on professional development. Now this is out of general fund. I know they spent more because I saw the report. However, remember, the foundation budget is supposed to be enough to adequately fund professional development along with everything else in the district. And East Hampton can't because they're having to spend the money on health insurance and special education. Instructional materials, when I do this presentation for parents, this one usually gets either a knowing snicker or people looking at the ceiling. This is why you have to send in copier paper and Kleenex and tissues and all of those bags of stuff at the beginning of the year. In East Hampton, they're spending just 28% of the foundation budget on instructional materials. And this one tends to kind of get lost, except for the people who are sending the bags of materials in, and the teachers who are piling their shopping carts the week before school starts. Operations and maintenance, which is all the custodial stuff, anything that isn't a capital spending. East Hampton spent 66.7% of the foundation budget on operations and maintenance. This is another one that tends to get hit, okay? So East Hampton is spending just a smidge over foundation, and they're seeing almost every single one of their foundation budget categories get hit by health insurance and special education. I thought it would be useful, because we are talking regionally, to give you an idea of what it looks like in other districts. So on that chart, Amherst Pelham was an obvious thing. I said that even in a district like Amherst Pelham, where they're spending 35% over foundation, you're still going to see the health insurance gap, right? So in Amherst Pelham, they're undercalculated by $4 million on health insurance. You assume that you see something parallel in special education, so they have to start their budget finding this $4 million here, $4 million in special education. However, Amherst Pelham is spending 35% over foundation. So if you actually go into their section by section, the only category in which they're underspending is still instructional materials. So they probably still have parents who are sending bags of supplies in. But again, Amherst Pelham is still underspending on instructional materials. I think that if you were to talk to someone from Amherst Pelham, and I've had these conversations in places like that, they would say, it feels like we're continuing to fund education at this high level, but we're not really seeing the return that we would think that we are. And that's true everywhere. I've been in districts where they're spending 100% over foundation. And that's because in most of those cases, that money is going to backfill the health insurance and special education. So it's not hitting their districts, but they're feeling it because they're filling those holes with tax dollars. And it's not so much that they're resenting the money going to the schools, it's that the money isn't actually hitting the classrooms. And it's not hitting the classrooms because it's these two categories that are so heavily undercalculated. Okay, the people who are most hit by this are the districts that have no wiggle room. So Holyoke is a local one. I could run you the same numbers for Springfield. I could run you the same numbers for my own district of Worcester. Holyoke only accounted for 65% of their health insurance account in FY16. But Holyoke has no place to go. Okay, so Holyoke has to start by finding, what, $4 million here, probably another $4 million in special education. Holyoke has to go in other accounts in order to find it.
Can I ask a clarification?
Absolutely.
The wiggle room?
Yes.
Explain that, like where that wiggle room comes from?
Sure. So if you think back to the chart of all of the bars going across the screen, Holyoke is just at that foundation level. Anything over that is essentially not accounted for by that spreadsheet that we saw at the beginning. So that was the state's assumption on how much it costs you to run your school system. If you have a little more than that, you can then backfill the fact that some of those categories are undercalculated without having to hit the other categories. So if health insurance in that chart is out of whack, right? It's less. The state's saying that you're spending less than you actually have to, and the same thing with special education. If you're funding over foundation, you then can put that money towards those two categories without having to pull it out of classroom teachers or pull it out of someplace else. If you're a place like Holyoke, you don't have any choice, but if all that money goes into health insurance and special education, you're going to have to pull it out of some of those other categories. And then if you're Amherst, that's where your over foundation money is probably going. You might be overspending, and I use the term advisedly because I don't think we're probably overspending in any of these. But you actually have the room to do that without having to hit your classroom teachers or someplace else. I'm glad you stopped me. And I should have said that at the beginning, that if you're lost, stop me. This is probably hundreds of teachers, okay? I know it's hundreds of teachers in Springfield. It's hundreds of teachers in Worcester. The Holyoke classroom teaching account in FY16 was only funded at 58%. Now, Liz and I were having this conversation earlier. If you pulled all the districts that are under receivership, they'd all have a chart like this. Make of that what you will. Again, with the same cautionary tale around professional development, Holyoke gets Title IIA. I know they're spending grant money on this. However, again, they're supposed to be able to fund professional development from the general fund. They barely were able to fund any professional development from the general fund because, I mean, honestly, if you're Holyoke, you got to pull the money from somewhere. You can fund that a different way. But you're supposed to be able to fund it from this. Instructional materials, only 36% of the foundation budget. Operations and maintenance, 83%. It's not bad, actually. And administration funded at 90% of foundation. I include this because everybody always likes to pick on administration. I will tell you that in most districts that are funding at the foundation level, they're underfunding administration. There's not a lot of overspending going on in administration. So that is where we're at as of FY16. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nathaniel because he's going to talk to you about what happens next. Absolutely. Their guidance counselors are part of Pupil Services. We have, interestingly, so I ran a bunch of these numbers in FY14. I've seen Pupil Services start to creep up. So when people are having to make choices, two places where I'm seeing them start to creep up is instructional leadership, which is principals and assistant principals, and Pupil Services, which is guidance counselors and adjustment counselors and all of those. Yep.
You might have addressed this earlier, but just to clarify, the foundation budget, where the money that's coming from local property taxes as opposed to money from the state?
Yep.
Like, is the foundation budget, that's the state funding?
So, okay, so if we wanted to be here for another half an hour, I could walk you through the municipal wealth formula, which is the other half. No, but it's an important point. Essentially what the state does is it does a separate calculation, and it says, okay, if this is how much we think you need to spend on education to fund education adequately, we're now going to look at how much you as a either municipality or as a district can afford to fund of that amount. It's based on property taxes and it's based on local income. They do a calculation, and there's a spreadsheet for this on the DESE website too, based on those two numbers, and they come up with a percentage of the foundation budget that you can actually fund locally. And then they say to your district, you are required to spend X amount within your foundation budget of that. The state kicks in the rest as Chapter 70, State 8.
What percentage, what's the range of percentage?
Nobody gets less than 17% of their foundation budget, whether they need it or not. And the highest ones I've seen are about 85% coming in as state aid. You're welcome. Yep.
Any of the variables you talked about were vastly different for regional districts?
So there's a couple of things. Regional districts, because there is a big chunk of their budget that is transportation, they get a little thrown off when you start talking about the foundation budget because transportation isn't included. So there essentially is like this other category that sits there where they're kind of heavily dependent on what amount of the percent of reimbursement they're going to get for transportation. Other than that, regionals get into funny conversations around how much each town has to kick in towards their regional thing. And that can work two ways. The state has a formula for it, but then there are districts where they actually have worked it out in the regional agreement. And I'm seeing, I have to say, every year on budget time, you see those tensions come to the fore of should we rework the regional agreement? Should we be doing this a different way? A lot of that has to do with district enrollment and patterns that each town is seeing. Yes?
Since we're going through the terminology, can you clarify net school spending? How
Sure.
it fits into this?
So net school spending is at its base how much the local municipality is required to spend on education. It isn't necessarily equivalent to the district's amount without the Chapter 78 of the foundation budget, because there can be carryover from prior years if they're funding under from previous years. There's other things going on there too in terms of the level of contribution that you're required to do percentage by percentage. Sometimes they're going up or down. They're trying to get you in a particular direction. But most of the places where those two numbers don't line up, it's because a previous year has been underfunded and there's carryover.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to turn you over to Nathaniel.
Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Nathaniel Shea. I'm the Chief of Staff for State Senator Sonia Chang Diaz, who is the Senate Chair of the Education Committee. They have House and Senate chairs in the legislature, so she's one of the co-chairs. Has been, this is her fourth session now doing that. So I work with her on education matters, and we've come up with a bill to fix this problem that Tracy's been telling you all about. In the 2015 fiscal year budget, the state, in its great wisdom, created what's called the Foundation Budget Review Commission. How many of y'all are familiar with that?
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
All right. So, over the course of about a year, the commission, which was made up of stakeholders across the education spectrum, school committees represented, superintendents, teachers, parent organization, there was an economists, vocationals, regionals, school business officials, the whole gamut. And we held 6 hearings across the state in all different regions of the state. The one out here was in Northampton. And heard from everybody who wanted to talk. And over and over and over again, the message we were hearing was, it's just not enough. We've had to cut this, we've had to cut that. My healthcare costs are this much higher than what you think they are, et cetera, over and over and over again. And so we came out with a set of recommendations after a year of deliberation, and they were unanimously approved by the commission, which I just want to highlight is something that never happens in education, as I'm sure you all know. So I'm going to run you through them real quick, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you guys have about them. The first one, as Tracy has very effectively highlighted, was to fix the way we assume healthcare costs are going to go. When we created this formula in 1993, that was before Bill Clinton had even come out with his healthcare plan. That was before Hillary got on the national stage. This is a long time ago. And we just had no idea how much healthcare costs were going to inflate. So we attached this random little inflation factor called the implicit price deflator, which is sort of like the consumer price index, but for government purchases, and just said, that'll work. And it didn't. As Tracy showed you, that's been 1%, 2%. A couple of years ago, it was negative 0.22%. Nobody's healthcare went down by 0.22% in any year since I've been alive. So we decided, instead of, we just don't have an actual inflation factor that accurately predicts healthcare costs. We haven't come up with that. And so the commission urged us to just exercise some humility and to actually go on actual costs. So what we did was we're recommending that instead of just picking this random number, we're going to say the last 3 years average of the state's health insurance system, which is called the Group Insurance Commission. It's how I get my health insurance. A lot of school districts, in fact, use it to get their health insurance. And it's been a very efficient method of scaling up health and keeping costs down, relatively speaking, to a lot of health insurance. And so we're going to track it to that, the last 3 years average, to avoid giant volatility. And then that's how we're going to say it's going to go up next year, because it'll probably go up pretty similar to that. That's a huge difference. That's a matter of a few $100 million a year statewide. The special education issue that Tracy mentioned, we were kind of close in 1993 on predicting the number of special ed kids that we would have in our school districts. We thought it would be about 15%, as she said. It turns out it's been about 16%. So it's just bumping it up from 15 to 16 to come in line with what's actually being reported in our districts. And to adjust the cost for out-of-district placements, which, as Tracy mentioned, has also not kept up with reality. And then there's 2 others. One is English language learner students. As Tracy mentioned, would you mind going back to the spreadsheet for East Hampton?
Ways back. Hang on. Let's do it this way.
So for English language learners, we assumed back then that English language learners were going to cost a certain amount in elementary school, a certain amount in middle school, a certain amount in high school, and those would all be different. And it's kind of turned out that they weren't. That it's actually, we're getting kids coming into our schools all throughout. It's not, kids aren't just starting in kindergarten as English language learners and then graduating in 12th grade. Kids are arriving in 11th grade. Kids are arriving in 7th grade. So we actually need to have a uniform number across these. So we went with the middle school number, which was the highest of all of them, and are just recommending to put it across all of the ages. And also to apply it to vocational students. For some reason in 1993, we did not allow English language learners to be counted also as vocational students. So it was one or the other. And so to allow our friends in the vocational schools to actually have the money to adequately educate their kids, we're bringing it all throughout the whole system. And then the final one, and this is a biggie, especially for districts like Holyoke or Springfield or Worcester, is to actually recognize what we now know a quarter century later it costs to educate students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. We just had no idea. We tried, it was an amazing, progressive, courageous thing that we did to actually even have a low-income allotment in the first place. This was groundbreaking in education funding in our country. But the number that we chose, even with the inflation that we've seen since then, we have learned is just not adequate to provide the services that a lot of low-income students need, and especially that a lot of districts with high concentrations of low-income students need. What we've seen from national best practices, from a lot of research, is that one low-income student in a wealthy district is less expensive per kid to educate than one low-income student in a poor district. That when you have concentrations of poverty, that adds layers to the costs that you need, to the interventions that you need. Maybe that one kid in Lexington maybe just needs one intervention, right? If you've got 45 kids in a 100-person school in Boston or in Holyoke or in Springfield, that one intervention is maybe not going to reach all of them. Maybe they need 3, maybe they need 4, maybe they need more counselors and trauma services, maybe they need dental services. Maybe they extended day, early education, and every district's different, every kid's different, and so we realized that we need to actually provide districts with higher concentrations of poverty more per student so that they can offer those multiple simultaneous interventions. So we recommend breaking the state into different groups based on their concentrations of poverty and having a higher allotment for low-income students in the districts with high concentrations than in the districts with lower concentrations. Yeah, question? It's literally like going with the districts that have the highest concentration of economically disadvantaged students and the districts with the lowest concentrations. And so that is, I can't highlight enough how much of a game changer that is for a lot of the districts around the state that serve these kids. It would be tens of millions of dollars a year for districts like Holyoke, for districts like Springfield, for districts like Worcester. So those are the 4 money recommendations. There's one more that's not as sexy for folks because it doesn't involve money, but it's very, very important. It's to create a data advisory task force. Something that we saw, as Tracy mentions, we do a really good job of tracking funding from the state to districts. And then we do a really lousy job of tracking funding from the districts to schools to kids. So we found as we were going through the process that we couldn't really determine if the dollars that were sent to a district for low-income students were actually getting to the low-income students, or the dollars that were sent for special education services were actually getting into a special education teacher's hands. So this task force is designed to provide recommendations to DESE to help them help us all and help the state in future policy decisions understand better how the money is flowing at the school level, so that we can just have more knowledge to make wiser decisions in the future. So happy to answer any questions if anybody has them. And we can also get into how we can get this done. Yes, sir.
Can I ask Tracy a question?
Yeah.
Of course.
I haven't looked at this budget yet, but perhaps I was really shocked to see where we were above the foundation budget. I actually assumed it much higher. And I know that probably the money we spent catching up to foundation as
probably, it depends on the district. It's a combination of those. The other thing that I've seen in looking at these, there were a couple, if you looked at that are jagged, but most of them tend to pretty steadily go up. And I think that that's honestly probably the real trick, is that it's hard to catch up to those levels. If you've been steadily spending over, you essentially tend to continue to spend over. So I mean, I had a conversation recently with someone in my mayor's office, and they said, okay, so 20% of our foundation, what would that be for Worcester? And I said it would be $60 million. Worcester's not going to come up with $60 million for next year. East Hampton's not going to come up with how many more millions of dollars it would be for you. So I think that's honestly it, is that while it in some cases involves overrides, I mean, I was in Pittsfield earlier this week. Pittsfield is an outlier because it's a gateway city that's spending 15% over foundation. They've hit their levy limit, and they have no place else to go. They voted last night to lay off 67 teachers. So that's the other part of the answer, is that some who have been racing to do this are actually now finding that they can't go any farther. Particularly, again, true of the gateways that are more heavily dependent on state aid, and thus are more heavily getting hit by the fact the state has made up the difference. Yes?
No question for Dale.
Yes?
So, sorry, let me real quick, can I do a follow-up on him first? The money that we all spend on schools, it all, like, as Tracy mentioned, we calculate the wealth of the local town and we determine a percentage of foundation that the state's going to fund and a percentage that the local community has to fund. But all the money that, our communities put towards our schools, it comes from our local town's general fund. That's coming from fire departments, from police, from roads, from parks, from libraries, from municipal staff, so that when I go to the local town hall, I can actually learn about the zoning at my house. These are all the things that our towns are having to look under the couch cushions for or cut to be able to fund our schools. My parents live in Spencer, about 40 minutes east of here. And the Spencer East Brookfield School District is struggling, and they're struggling right at foundation at best. And they've had to close their town hall a few days a week. They've closed their library. The property values as a result are going down, and that ends up hurting their ability to raise local revenue, which then hurts their ability to keep their town hall open for the other 2 days a week that it's open. So it becomes a cycle, a vicious cycle, and it's something that the state needs to fix. In the Constitution that Tracy mentioned before, it demands that we cherish our education system. It doesn't say we support it. It doesn't say we do enough to, make kids just kind of learn. It says we cherish it. Think of all the things in your life that you cherish. How do you treat them? You give them as much as you can. You build them up. You lift them over your head. And it's not what we're doing with our schools right now. It's not what we're able to. We all want to. It's a question of demanding from our leadership that we honor that. So, I get on my little soapbox there, but.
My name is Henry Everett, and I'm the chair of the Granby School Committee. And I was at the Day on the Hill event Tuesday. I really appreciate everything that's been done around this. I really appreciate Senator spearheading all these efforts.
He's asking for some volume over here, sorry.
Volume.
Should we give him the mic?
Okay.
Oh, here.
Let me do that.
You've done this before.
Yes.
I was starting with giving our thanks. I'm sure it is shared among everyone for spearheading this effort to take a look at a foundation budget calculation that has not been working for many, many years. One thing that concerned me, however, on Tuesday in Boston was the response to the question as to when we can make this happen, this new formula happen. And I think what I heard was something like a 7 to 10 year timeline. The challenge is that many of us who have been going through this for a while now and have been pleading with our communities to give us extra money to be able to make the ends meet, we don't really have 7 to 10 years to wait. Understandably, this is a political issue, not only a financial issue, because the finance basically bleeds into politics, and there is no appetite to raise taxes to be able to come up with the amount of money that is needed. I think you had something like $1 billion at the very least, that is the current gap, right? Is there an opportunity to chunk down the problem and focus on some of the items that you are sharing with us today.
Mhm.
Whether first hit the special education item,
Mhm.
transportation item, health, especially health insurance item.
Mhm.
Can we at least start chasing those as soon as possible so that we can see some impact on
There's
our
this slide.
budgets
What's
to be able to
Devin,
make ends meet immediately or
Yeah.
in the near future?
Right.
Because I have to tell you, the last 6 months or so, now it turns out somewhat too optimistically, as we stood in front of our town and told them that hope is coming, we talked about two things. One was the improvement on the foundation budget, and the other one is the Fair Share Act. When I got in the car to get back to Granby from Boston on Tuesday, I was, to be very honest, very demoralized, understanding that hope may not be coming as soon as we thought was going to come on either one of those items.
Mhm.
So just I would appreciate your thoughts on this.
Boy, I would love to spend $1.5 billion right now on this. So there's a few challenges with that. One is that we don't have $1.5 billion sitting around right now. It would be dependent on either finding revenue somewhere, the fair share amendment being a large piece of that, or revenue growth, which is something that happens every year that we kind of overlook. State revenues do grow every year. This year they're projected to grow by about $1 billion. Now about 2/3 of that's going to get eaten up by healthcare, by mass health. So that only leaves a few $100s of new revenue that we're working with in the state. And I think my boss said this at the meeting on Tuesday, that the governor and the House of Representatives, the numbers that they put towards Chapter 70 and education spending are a little bit different, but they're in the ballpark of about $100 million new. So we have $100 million for sure that we can put towards doing these improvements right now, this year. I think we've got a little more than that, and my boss is gonna try to find that, but it's a simple reality that this year, in this fiscal year, we cannot plan for $1.5 billion in new state revenue. So what this would do is, it doesn't actually set out a specific timeline. 7 years is how long it took in '93, we would hope it would certainly be. It could happen in 5 years. If we get the fair share tax, that's a complete game changer. But we don't want to count on that. So it says we look every year before the budget process starts. The chairs of Ways and Means and the Secretary of Administration and Finance in the state sit down, and we look at how much money we think we're going to have, and we decide before we get into debating all the other stuff, how much we're going to put towards fixing our education funding system. I wish I could tell you and the people of Granby that that we could do this with a snap of the fingers, and we simply don't have the revenue at the moment to do it all at once. But we absolutely do to phase it in, and that's something that anytime I explain this to folks, they ask, where's the money going to come from, or how are you going to pay for it? We're going to pay for it with money that we will have. Every year, state revenues go up. But on the flip side of that, we can't do it all at once.
So when you say phase it in,
Yeah.
what are some examples of that?
So it would be, say right now, the best thing to what the bill does is it sets the end goal for all of these rates, all that chart that Tracy put up, and says when they sit down every year to decide how much we're going to put toward it, they have to decide how far along that path they're going to be able to go on those rates. So say the rate for whatever was supposed to go from 5,000 to 10,000. The end goal is 10,000. Maybe one year you go up to 6,000. Next year you go up to 7,000. So it's moving all of them in that direction. There's a concern about splitting them up. I absolutely understand why you would want to say tackle the discrete piece of healthcare, but that's something. Healthcare is, as I said when I was starting, this is an issue that unites everybody. It's unprecedented. So, my boss has been in the Senate. It's her 9th year now. She's never seen anything like this, and she's the big education nerd in the Senate. This kind of consensus we're getting from people that usually disagree about everything is incredible. But as you start picking off different pieces of the bill to pass and leaving others that have not passed yet, you start losing people from that consensus. You start losing political will. So there's a lot of districts for whom the health insurance is a big deal. And say we passed that, then maybe half of them, health insurance was the only deal. And so they don't really have to care about the rest of the bill. And that's a problem for Holyoke maybe, who really needs the low income allotment. And when you're also looking at political capital, looking back through the history of our democracy, low income folks have typically not held the upper hand. So maybe leaving them at the end to say, well, we'll get to you, is not going to actually get them to the end point. This is something that we need to do all together, statewide, so that we're lifting all boats at the same time. Hope that answers your question. Yes?
Definitely Amherst School Committee. The big factor that affects our finances at agency up here is charter school loss.
Yeah.
And so, like when I look at our costs for the last 10 years, over a third of our cost increase is from charter school loss. So there's, one is loss of enrollment in charter schools, the other is the last few fiscal years, right, not getting full reimbursement from the state. So I don't know if you can talk about how you think about that, how the senator thinks about that in relation to this, because, you know, in the last 6 months, especially since November 8th, you know, I do feel a positive increase in collaborative energy.
Yep.
But it's, in my mind, it's about where do we focus it for the most bang for our buck, right? And so there's fixing the charter formula and then there's this. So.
Yeah. Oh boy, charter schools. The Senate tried that last year. We passed a bill in the Senate. It was called the RISE Act, that included these recommendations and these funding improvements, and tried to do a whole bunch of stuff fixing charter policy, fixing, you know, the issue of attrition and stability of the student populations, fixing discipline issues, fixing the funding formula, and it passed the Senate, and then that's as far as it got. And that was partly because a lot of folks on different parts of that argument didn't want it to go any farther. A lot of folks wanted the ballot question. They wanted to just finally, we've been yelling at each other about this for a decade. I'm sick of it. Let's have our day on the ballot. And it's a choice that, you know, the state made politically to let it go that far, and it went that far, and now the question's effectively politically settled for quite some time. When there's a ballot question on something like that, folks, that you know, that sort of clears the room of that issue for at least the short and medium term. So my answer to that is boy, I'd love to fix that stuff, but there isn't going to be the political interest in doing so. The Senate went out on a limb last year and tried to do so and put together what I thought was the best bill. I'd been in the Senate 6 years, or working in the Senate 6 years. I'd never seen a piece of legislation this good. And we got beat up about it. And then both the charter side and the union side said it was garbage because it wasn't 100% of what they wanted. So I mean, that's what we,
Pretty bleak assessment.
yeah. I mean, I wish I could give you a better one. The charter reimbursement line item in the budget is it's a separate issue. That's something we got to fund every year, and we've been doing a completely lousy job of fulfilling our obligation there. And that's something my boss actually files the amendment in the Senate every year to fully fund that. And we're, this year, probably only going to do it at about 50%. We're going to try as best we can. Last year we were in the 60s, but the assessment's gone up, and the governor put it, I think, at $80.5 million in his budget proposal. And the estimate's at about 155, I think, for how much it's going to cost. That's always a projection because it depends on how students flow. But so we're going to do our best to get as many more millions in that through the budget process that comes to the Senate next month as we can. But that's something that really has fallen victim to the political divisiveness that's kind of engulfed that issue. People in the charter camp and people in the district camp really have not been able to see eye to eye on this, politicians and grassroots stakeholders alike, and it's really, really damaged our ability to fix it, unfortunately.
If I can, let me tie your question though back to his question. which is that this is where we're at right now in terms of where things have happened. We do still have one more step to come in terms of FY18, which is that the Senate hasn't had their budget yet. And I agree with Nathaniel, this is not going to be the magic answer to everything. However, we've seen the first political, I don't put a lot of stock in the financial, but a little political will finally coming from the governor and from the House in terms of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, in that they increased the amount that health insurance is in the foundation budget for FY18. The governor took a small step, the House took another small step, marginal step. So you actually would have seen your foundation budget changed based on, if you had thought about it last year, what is it going to be for FY18? It's different than it would have been both in the governor and then in the House because they took those marginal steps. And again, the governor's budget increased the foundation budget by $66 million. Because of the way that the funding system works, it only increased Chapter 70 by $16 million. The House then increased that again marginally more. The Senate's still to come. And if you look back at sort of who has actually done anything about this at all, it's entirely been the Senate. The Senate passed the RISE Act. The Senate had the Foundation Budget Review Commission recommendations in their budget last year for FY17. If there is a part of the state government that we're going to depend on the most when it comes to this stuff, it's the Senate. The Senate's been the ones who have been out in front on this issue all the way across the board. So we still have one more shot at doing kind of anything for FY18. And again, I don't want to tell you that's going to be millions of dollars because it's not. But it's absolutely worth contacting senators at this point because they haven't even had their Ways and Means budget come out yet. And then we'll have amendments. And the Senate tends to be the one that actually is moving the most on this. And then I want to make sure also that we do actually mention why we have Nathaniel here at all. Not that he's a fan, just not good to hear him have him anyway, which is the Senate bill that actually would implement the recommendations. So the number that you want to know is 223. Anyone can sign on to a Senate bill, either House or Senate. So just because, if you have a better if you have a closer relationship with your representative, they can sign on to a Senate bill. Senators should do this. I'm going to say this as a Worcester resident whose representative still hasn't signed on to it. There's no excuse for anyone who's representing a district like Worcester or Holyoke or Springfield or whatever not to be signing on to this. We're the ones who are getting the hardest hit. However, you saw the charts, right? Amherst is not actually recognizing its health insurance accurately, essentially. And the funding that Amherst is shoveling into its schools is going into those locations rather than going into where it thinks that it is, right? So that is something that also can be happening. You can talk about FY18, but you also can talk about the Senate bill that would actually implement the whole recommendations. So those are what I would say are the conversations that you should be having right now because you have an ask for now. The answer you got to your question, Devin, was legislators need to do now, right? That was the thing we heard on earlier this week. So they're due now if they're a senator is you've got an FY18 budget. What are you going to do? Are you going to ignore this again? And then a due now for everybody is, are you a co-signer? And how fast is this moving? Devin.
So for a rep or senator that will not sign on, what is the one or two liner that they're giving of why they don't want to be involved with this legislation?
Where's the money going to come from?
That's the response people are going to get out mostly?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this like the response to that is this bill doesn't actually require them to spend the money. What it does is it requires them to say why they won't. We have to sit down and have a grown-up conversation about whether or not we're going to do this every single year. And then it provides an accountability structure, a political accountability structure for all of us in this room to then, if they don't do that, if they don't take us another significant step down the road that year, to say what's going on. It essentially sets up a democratic process over the next several years for us to hold our elected officials accountable to invest in our schools the way that we've been saying we've been doing this whole time.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
So this is a great thing that Senator Indiana is doing, and thank you, wonderful. But it seems like we all know that the problem is revenue. That's what Stanley Rosenberg has been saying for years.
Yeah.
And so what I was hoping we were going to come out of tonight
Yeah.
to make that an issue, because Stanley Rosenberg says we need $1 billion, and then Robert DeLeo says, no, and the governor says, no. So it seems as though we, as people who care about this, need to put some pressure on the governor and the speaker to start finding a revenue. It's not impossible. It's just a matter of political will.
Yeah.
So I was hoping we would come out of this tonight with some kind of action steps for how we can help you to find the money.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say this. The speaker, although it, at least from my perspective, often seems to work in the reverse direction, if there's enough members of the House who want this to happen, the speaker does actually have to do something. So there is worth in putting pressure there. I put less emphasis on the Senate because honestly the Senate has already acted twice and I think that we're probably in pretty good shape there. I agree with you because as someone who spends a lot of time looking at the state budget, okay, I can't find you $1 billion, but I could probably find you some money that maybe we could be doing different things with. You know, I looked at the House Amendment A, and I mean, line items are nice, but is that really an equitable way for us to be talking about education, or are we going back to, depending on how much political pull you have, you get more funding? That's a personal opinion rather than an MASC one, I should probably say. But that I think is probably a conversation to have. I will say this also, because I know that depending on your district, this may have been taken different ways. Do keep in mind that when we talk about a per pupil increase, that's actually not a progressive funding system. So I was actually really impressed by the state representative from Pittsfield who said this at the Joint Ways and Means hearing. Every time we do that, we take a step away from the Foundation Budget Review Commission implementation. As hard as that is for districts that depend on those increases come in over and above on top of the foundation formula, and they go to every district regardless of need. There's no recognition of a progressive system in that. So that can be really difficult depending on your district, because there are districts that desperately need those funds and are at the top of things. But that actually, every time we take a step in that direction, we take a step away from the other one. So the House actually putting the per pupil increase at 30 rather than going to 50 or 55 is, again, honestly, an acknowledgement of the fact that they need to be taking steps towards this rather than towards that. Just an important calculation to keep in your head at the state level.
But it's nowhere close to enough.
No.
It's the governor and the House both. The governor was calling it a down payment when he released his budget proposal a couple of months ago. And it would take, if we did that every year, it would take about 100 years to fully fund the recommendations. I just bought a house about 6 months ago. I don't think they would have accepted that down payment. It's just not enough. So it's a little tip of the cap, maybe. But in terms of what to do, yeah. Where do you live? Who's? Okay, so.
And don't say contact your representative.
Yeah.
We've done that.
Yep.
Stan Rosenberg is on board.
Yeah, you got him.
We need to go to the next level.
Yeah, Representative Kokot also is. He's your rep, right? Okay, so he's co-sponsored the bill.
So here's my first question. How much does Northampton understand about this? Like if you talk to your school committee or you talk to, do they have a good understanding of why it is that though Northampton is spending here, there are holes in the budget?
I'm on the school committee, yes, we do.
Okay.
What I'm trying to say is I think we all understand this problem. We need more money, and I think a lot of people in our community do too. But we need to somehow find a way to mobilize and make some noise.
Yeah.
And maybe do direct actions, form affinity groups, whatever
Yep.
it takes. But the traditional system of emailing your rep is
Yeah.
not working. So now what?
Yeah, well, I mean, don't give up on the emailing your rep, but there's certainly a lot more that you can do. You can hook up with advocacy groups that are pushing for this and that are pushing for the fair share tax. MASC is one of them, but there's dozens of them across the state, and I'd be very happy to connect you with the folks that are leading that campaign, so that you can start working in your own community to start getting that done. And talking to your friends and cousins and relatives, whoever, in other districts, perhaps in districts that aren't as progressive as Northampton. the Senate President and Representative Kokot are there, so it's a question of getting other people to be there. And also, them knowing what you want them to do isn't, it's necessary but not sufficient, let's say. You can tell them, hey, I want you to support the Foundation Budget Review Commission recommendations, and that's great. They'll say, okay, I do, and then maybe move on with their lives. But what you could also do is you could say, I want you to co-sponsor this bill. Did you co-sponsor this bill? And then write them back a month later and say, hey, did you co-sponsor this bill? If you haven't heard back. You can ask them to submit testimony on the bill to the Education Committee. Hey, did you submit testimony? Can you send me a copy of it, please, so that I can share it with my friends? Once the bill starts moving to the Ways and Means Committee, you can say, hey, did you submit a letter to the Ways and Means Committee urging them to report this bill out? Every step in the process requires advocacy. We're on the Education Committee. We have a giant spreadsheet that lists everybody that sent in testimony in favor or against a bill, every legislator that sent in a letter saying pass this or report this out favorably or don't report this out favorably. And that weighs in. The Ways and Means Committee will not report a bill out unless they get a letter from its sponsor. It requires you not just being engaged with your elected official, but insisting that your elected official is engaged with his or her colleagues. I mean, this would all be a lot easier if we just had single-payer health care, but.
I was going to say, there's a bill for that too.
Yeah, there is.
And I believe it's sponsored by Senator Eldridge, if you wanted to actually work on that end. You're not the first one to ask that question.
But yeah, I mean, this is something that's affecting every sector of our economy. And it's not like healthcare and education is not, fundamentally different than healthcare in the tech world or, in any other, industry or sector. It's not like we're missing education folks reaching out or education folks working to give their particular areas of expertise. It's a question of like the state on that issue having the political will and the savvy to be able to find ways to cut costs, find ways to maybe learn that investments actually produce savings, and find ways to make our health system single payer healthcare. So, yes. Oh, actually, you in the back. I'm sorry, you've been waiting.
So to your point about what the most effective thing is to do from this point forward. So for those of us on school committees, we do have a bit of a bully pulpit,
You do.
right, to engage the public.
Yep.
Even though our primary charge is to actually do the work of the school committee.
Yeah.
When the need arises, and certainly you've made an excellent case that the need is here.
Yeah.
We're conscripted into public and political activism, and so, but that's not our primary forte, right?
Yeah.
So maybe this is more of a question for Tracy, but how do we, when we want to put the energy into it, to the degree that we're able to, coordinate and organize? Because
Yeah.
I feel if I look at the common variable of when we've been successful, when we haven't been successful in my local town advocating for certain things outside of our town, it's when the organization has been the most efficient. It's when the collaboration outside of our town has been the most
Yeah.
organized. So instead of having to figure it out and reinvent the wheel
Yep.
every time because we're novices in this,
Yeah.
right? What's the best way for us to funnel our attention?
Well, I'll give an outside perspective on that and then let Tracy, who certainly knows a heck of a lot better, the inside perspective on it. You guys are really good at this. And on top of that, you're elected by the same people that the legislature is elected by. Every person that voted for you voted for or against the person that represents you in Beacon Hill. So you've got more leverage than the average Joe Schmo walking down the street. So I've heard from several offices, even only in the last couple of weeks, saying, hey, my local school committee member is all over me about this bill that you wrote. What's the deal with it? Tell me what it does. There's 6,000 bills in the legislature. This is one of the maybe more high profile ones, but it's not hard for folks to just, sort of eyes glaze over and not even know that this bill existed. So having somebody who, you've probably got, you know who voted for you, you've got an email list, you've got a little bit of a campaign operation, they know that. And that's a factor that they will take into consideration when weighing whether or not to co-sponsor this bill. And we've got 85 people signed on to this bill. This is not, an esoteric little thing. More than 40% of the legislature's on there. And you bet your britches I'm trying for 100. So, you guys work with MASC. They're amazing. There's a reason I reached out to Tracy to 6 months ago to start advocating on this bill. because they're really good at this. You guys blew the roof off the place during question 2. And like, I think maybe school committees don't realize the power that they have. You guys have the expertise and you have the muscle. And you know, it's time, like, you guys should be working with the Northampton School Committee and the Westfield School Committee and everywhere around here, you know, come together and get it done. We need you. Like, we need you to make us do stuff. That's how the whole system works.
So there is,
Yes, ma'am.
last night Pittsfield passed, and sometime in the next hour, Worcester is considering a resolution that actually calls for implementation of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. So parallel to so many of you passing resolutions opposing question 2, I know I've been on school committee, I know sometimes those feel like pro forma things, but there's 2 things that are important. First of all, it's not unusual for you to get a headline, which then gets publicity that this is a thing. Secondly, as Nathaniel's saying, you guys are seen as like the local people who have a clue about this stuff.
Yeah.
And if you guys are saying that this is a thing, then there's a lot of people who are going to say, oh, I guess this is a thing. And it's not just a thing for Springfield or Holyoke or whatever. It's actually a thing for us too. So I have the language. I don't have it photocopied, but I can email it out, certainly. It essentially walks through more or less what we just did. It's in the Constitution, it's in McDuffie, it's in the Foundation Budget Review Commission. You guys need to get your act together. And while individual advocacy is effective, if you as a committee then say, and not just honestly to your own delegation, but the people kind of next door hear that stuff too, that does actually matter. So that's something that you actually can do. You can put that on the agenda, and we will use our social media stuff, and you betcha we're going to tell, you know, just like we did during question 2, we are going to notice every single time that any school committee does something like that, which reminds me that I need to tweet out that Pittsfield did it last night. So that is actually something we can be doing now. And I do also think that that's one that, yes, you know, we've got Senator Rosenberg, yes, we've got whatever, but the ones who are next door start to actually pay attention that this is actually a regional issue. And also, whether or not they're hearing from their own district, when there are parallel districts that are starting to get active, it does actually start to make some of them wonder, maybe this is actually an issue for mine too, which is a healthy question for them to be asking. We do have stuff on our website. The recommendations are there. There's a place that not only you, but you can send people to then send emails to their own delegates. So that's one where, you know, asking your relatives in other districts that haven't signed on to send in. I also will say, and this isn't necessarily a plug, right now Progressive Mass is actually using this as a report card thing. So you can actually type in your zip code and find out whether or not your rep or a senator has co-sponsored. Easy way of checking rather than scanning the list. But those are places that you can do it, and I will talk to the office and see if we can get the resolution language up there too.
Write a letter to the editor once you get your headline after you do your resolution. That comes up next week. Write a letter to the editor of your local paper. You'll get 2 weeks coverage out of it.
And also, I should say, I was in Pittsfield earlier this week doing this. I was in Taunton 2 weeks ago doing this. If it would be useful to have someone come actually have this conversation just in your district, I actually presented before the Pittsfield City Council earlier this week. We can do that. I mean, I know that most of you who are on school committees regard us as the people at the other end of the phone, but we actually can come sort of explain this to people in your district if it's useful.
You guys are really lucky to have the leadership at MASC. They do amazing work. There's like 10 people in the state maybe that really deeply understand Chapter 70, and Tracy's one of them, and you know, they're hard to find. So I'm not one of them.
You're doing good.
I can't remember who. I think you were first. And then.
So, just to understand, what we're saying is that there's no magic bullet.
No.
Don't expect anything in advance.
Well,
we have to
expect
do
something.
This like grassroots.
Yeah.
Well, you know, the $10 extra that the House gave
Yeah.
in that district like ours that
Yeah.
has 800 students, that's $8,000, which will
Right.
not do anything.
Yeah.
But I understand your perspective.
Mhm.
It doesn't make any sense from my perspective and my town's perspective that it should take 7 to 10 years. But at the very least, I will urge everyone to really get to a level where we have a good narrative.
Mhm.
And here's an example for you. The same Day on the Hill event, we talked about the foundation budget, where we also heard that it may take up to 7 to 10 years to do this. Another speaker was talking about a Fair Share Act that is supposed to happen within the next 2 years.
Yep.
I'm now wondering why we are not aligning those two stories. At
Yeah.
the very least, tell folks that
Yeah.
if that happens,
Yeah.
it's going to take us 2 years.
Yeah.
If it doesn't happen, just like the gentleman there was saying,
Yeah.
we have these steps that we are taking to help you guys in different ways.
Yep.
What I felt as I left Boston that day,
Yeah.
it's pretty similar to what that gentleman said. I felt feeling like I had nothing to hold on to because this one is 7 to 10 years. The other one, well, maybe because we're not seeing the opposition yet, it may get bigger. Just like you're saying, you don't have the magic bullet.
Yeah.
We don't have any magic bullets left either.
Yeah.
So we don't know how to fund our districts
Right.
in the coming years if
Yeah.
it's going to go beyond the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you heard from Representative Kaufman. And
Yeah.
honestly, if you've been to MASC events, Representative Kaufman shows up pretty frequently because of exactly that reason. Because our best bet at it not taking a longer phase in, and the reason that he's saying
Yeah.
7 to 10 years is because in '93 we had no income stream identified. We passed the reform law, and there was no answer. Like there wasn't even like anything like the fair share. We just said we were going to do it. The reason that you heard those two is because to MASC's mind, those two are linked. So our delegate assembly passed something in favor of the foundation budget and something in favor of the fair share amendment last November. And that's why when we present to you on the foundation budget, we are also often presenting to you on the fair share amendment, because more than anything else, you want to talk about a ground game,
Yeah.
that one's going to take a ground game. And so while we're telling you to pass resolutions on the FBRC right now, there may come a time where we need to start talking about whether or not school committees pass something in terms of fair share. We're not there yet because we still have to do another round with the Senate and the House, but that day may well be coming. And
Yeah.
yes, that's why those two came through together, because when you start to, I mean, you can talk about low income, you can talk about ELL. When you start talking about billions of dollars, you need to start talking about something like that. So yes, that was not an accident.
Yeah. So the reason the 7 to 10 years is because we need to do this even if we don't get that, even if we don't get the fair share. But that would help a lot, and it would help it go a lot quicker. And passing this is why I want to get this done like yesterday, is that passing this into place gives us an actual something to point to for the fair share amendment. When I'll bet you all the money in my pocket against all the money in your pocket that in a year and a half, when we're seeing TV ads, it's going to be about the legislature blowing your money on whatever you want, whatever they want, and being all willy-nilly up on Beacon Hill, which isn't the case almost ever. But nonetheless, that's the sort of line that we constantly hear coming back up anytime we're raising taxes on anyone. And so this gives us something like, no, we've got this thing in place. If we put $1 billion into education next year, it's going right there. It's going right into that 3rd grade classroom. It's going right into Holyoke. It's going right into Granby. So they're not going to go on a fishing trip with it. It's it actually gives us an argument to pass the fair share amendment, which we need not just for education, but for a crumbling transportation system to actually get a commuter rail out here.
So because I say this because of where I am in the state and thinking of the politics here, if you are in a district where you can start to have that conversation, by all means go ahead and start having that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that is not a bad association to be making if it is one that actually is politically healthy to be making, because we're all going to get there.
Thank you. Yes, miss. Oh.
Okay, one more?
So please feel to say, like, I'll get back to you later about this if it's not salient enough for the group, but I talked to someone who was like, I'm going to this thing tonight, and this person's been in education and economic development for a long time, and he's like really jaded about the foundation budget because he's really focused on rural communities, and he said, we've been advocating for such a long time to make sure, like, to make up its discrepancy around transportation.
Yeah.
In those communities, and so that made me curious, and I was kind of hoping as you went through the things that would be addressed, I was like, oh, wait for it, and so.
No, rural schools were not one of the recommendations. Yes. So there's two things. First of all, there is some rural organization going on around whether or not there should be an increment that's actually included. I will say this, and this is coming from a Central Mass perspective, because of the distance between where most of the rural districts are and where the decisions gets made, I think that those voices are largely not being heard. So I think that that's actually really the big sway there, because you're actually seeing some of those districts not only be dealing with some of this, but also be dealing with the other kinds of stuff. I did have a conversation earlier this week. There's, the Berkshire County Task Force is actually meeting around regionalization and whether or not they're doing that. There are some things that are going on around things like accountability that Desi's talking about, which may actually end up not necessarily helping in terms of the funding end, but in terms of the conversations around how they can do more work together. So no, there is not a rural component in this. It's not included in any of the bills I know of. There is, however, probably more advocacy happening now, and I think that those voices are being heard more now than probably, I don't know, Pat, anytime in the last ever, maybe?
Well, Tommy and I were just saying, 7 years it took from 93.
Yes.
And
I was going to say, is there anything that
long ago.
that Poppy wants to say, or that, I mean, Liz has been going to those meetings. Is there anything that you want to add about that? Because they.
So the Berkshire folks have been meeting a long time together thoughtfully around planning about how they can address sort of that geographic difference and that transportation. And the Berkshires in particular, the economy related directly to internet access, right? And
Yes.
Who's coming back to the Berkshires to live and work if you can't even, if you're on dial-up where you have no internet? And Pittsfield just put this one more forward. Using GE.
Yes.
Huge employer in the region. So the Berkshire group is meeting thoughtfully and consistently and planning, not sort of quick changes, but changes that the community stakeholders can buy into, can see the value to them and their kids. How can we work together to provide a richer, more robust education for the kids in the schools, as opposed to continually taking stuff away, right? So that's how they're getting on the map and being heard. And there are other regions, Franklin County, Cape, Barksville County, that are in the same boat.
The Mohawk Trail Superintendent has set up a rural superintendent's association.
Right.
And we had a rural summit, and we are now setting up an effort to try to provide to get a group of schools who are willing to work with us to provide to conjoin in service provisions, so that whether it's doing payroll, something that can be centralized, and then maybe setting up. So we're looking for partners in an area where people would like to have services, to think about conjoining services. I don't have any literature with me today, but it's Michael Bonconti at mohawkschools.org, and he's willing to go anywhere at any time.
He was in Boston this week.
Pitches for what we're trying to do. I did it Tuesday with.
Yes, he did.
They did a great job.
And Alice Peich, and we met with Jeff Wilson and Commissioner Pfizer, and we spent a lot of days on the Hill trying to push this to make the eastern part of the state aware of the needs of the western area of the state school situation. Transportation.
If you could all join me in thanking Tracy and Nathaniel so much. And thank you to all of you who came out and spent your evening on this topic. And I hope that we'll get an opportunity to gather and work together sometime soon to really see some action on the foundation budget and then also on the Fair Share Amendment. It sounds like an equally important thing to be working on here as advocates for public schools. So thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for putting it together.